In 1198, Pope Innocent III, eager to restore Jerusalem to Christian rule, proclaimed a new crusade. Count Louis of Blois and many French knights took the cross. In 1200, the illustrious Count Baldwin IX of Flanders also vowed to lead a force to the east, as did Boniface of Montferrat. These lords adopted Richard the Lionheart's plan of conquering Egypt as a means toward securing Jerusalem. The lords sent envoys to meet with Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, to contract ships to transport their armies to Egypt, estimating that the crusade would number around 26,500 men. The envoys contracted Venice for 50 ships. The Venetians stopped all other commercial activity and devoted their full efforts toward constructing the fleet. But since no king commanded the crusade, many knights did not feel obliged to depart from Venice and left by other ports. The army that actually assembled at Venice numbered around 12,000. The Crusade's leaders were in the awkward position of needing only a third of the galleys commissioned, and having no means to pay for the rest. Enrico Dandolo asked the Crusaders to recoup Venice's loss by conquering Zara, a city on the Dalmatian coast formerly under Venetian power. The Crusade's leaders were disturbed by this offer, since Zara was a Christian city, and yet it was a tempting means of erasing their debt. The Doge argued that his claim to Zara was lawful. Louis, Baldwin, and Boniface allowed themselves to be convinced and agreed to subdue Zara, though the decision spread dissent throughout the army. Many knights, including Simon of Montfort, argued that this was a violation of their sacred vows. After a week-long siege, Zara fell and was returned to Venetian rule. Hearing of this, Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire Crusader army. The French lords sent envoys to the Pope, begging his forgiveness. After the French made a repentance, Innocent lifted the excommunication, but maintained his condemnation of Venice. But Boniface of Montferrat intercepted the papal envoys carrying Innocent's reproof of the Venetians. While still at Zara, the Crusaders received emissaries from Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos. Alexios was currently staying at the court of Philip of Swabia, but his envoys explained to the Crusaders that he was the rightful Byzantine emperor who had blinded and imprisoned Isaac. The envoys asked the Crusaders to restore Alexios to Constantinople's throne. If they did, Alexios would join their crusade, add the Byzantine army to their ranks, and provide lucrative funds from the Byzantine treasury. The Crusade's leaders were intrigued. Byzantine participation would be a great asset to their war against Egypt. The idea of a diversion to Constantinople reawakened controversy in the army. Simon of Montfort was the loudest critic, and the majority of the rank-and-file soldiers, eager to fight the Muslims, agreed with him. Nevertheless, Count Louis, Count Baldwin, and Boniface of Montferrat signed a treaty with Alexios, agreeing to restore him to Constantinople. Many knights, including Simon of Montfort, abandoned the army, traveling on their own to Outremer. As the Crusaders sailed for Constantinople, they received an angry letter from Pope Innocent, forbidding them to travel to Byzantium. Once again, the Crusades' leaders hid the message from the rank and file. They camped outside of Constantinople's walls. Boniface and the Doge brought Prince Alexios out onto the deck of a Venetian galley, and cruising along the city, displayed him for the people, shouting their good intentions. The citizens on the wall responded with curses, insults, and even arrows. Clearly, Alexios had exaggerated the enthusiasm of Constantinople's citizens for his cause. The diversion to Byzantium had greatly reduced the army's size. To withdraw now would mean the Crusades' collapse. Therefore, the Crusaders decided to attack Constantinople, an all but impossible task, considering their numbers. Nevertheless, in July 1203, the Crusaders began their assault. By August 1st, after fierce fighting, the Crusaders had managed to take control of the city. They raised Prince Alexios to the throne, and he was crowned Emperor Alexios IV. Despite the coronation of Alexios, anti-Western feeling was rampant in Constantinople, and the young emperor did not fully control the city. He failed to deliver the troops or funds he'd promised the Crusaders, who remained camped outside Constantinople's walls. Murtzuphlus, a Greek nobleman, organized an anti-Latin faction, and seized control of the city. Murtzuphlus had Alexios IV strangled to death and proclaimed himself emperor, shutting the city gates to the Crusaders. Murtzuphlus' coup inspired new fury in the Crusaders. They determined to retake Constantinople, besieging the city in April 1204. After a few days, Constantinople fell. Murtzuphlus was seized and executed. The Greek clergy approached the Crusades' leaders and begged them to be merciful toward the ancient capital of the Christian East, but their plea fell on deaf ears. The Crusades' leaders permitted their men to sack the Byzantine capital, and for 3 days Constantinople was subject to pillage and vandalism at the hands of the Crusaders. The Crusaders' brutal sack of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout Christendom, and the criticisms of knights such as Simon of Montfort seemed confirmed. Pope Innocent III condemned the Crusaders, issuing a scathing bull of excommunication against them. Today, the Fourth Crusade is remembered as the most bizarre and unsettling episode in the history of the numbered Crusades. How is it that a Crusader army destined for Egypt had instead been turned against Christian cities? Some have imagined that the Fourth Crusaders plotted to take Constantinople all along and were motivated by greed for the wealth of Byzantium, and had never even intended to wage a crusade against Egypt. But historians have shown that this is incorrect. Leading Crusades historian Christopher Tyerman says, quote, "There is no convincing evidence that the Crusaders plotted the violent overthrow of the Byzantine system until they were presented with no viable alternative in 1204. In other words, the Crusaders intended originally to ally with Alexios IV in a crusade against Egypt, and only when he was assassinated and Murtzuphlus closed the city gates in the Crusaders' faces did they intend to conquer and exploit Constantinople. Without question, the politics that led up to the Fourth Crusade were complicated, and indeed it was a Byzantine factional dispute that brought the Crusaders to Constantinople in the first place. Jonathan Phillips, an historian and expert on the Fourth Crusade, writes, "The reason why the Fourth Crusade went to Constantinople in the late spring of 1203 was, ironically, in response to the invitation of a Greek, the appeal by Prince Alexios to help him and his father secure what they regarded as their rightful position as the rulers of the Byzantine Empire. Had this request not been made, there is no convincing evidence to suggest that the expedition would have turned towards Constantinople. Nevertheless, once the Crusaders did gain control of the city the second time, they elected to sack it mercilessly." Tensions had been rising between the Latin West and the Greek East for decades, and recently the Byzantine Empire had actively worked to hinder the Third Crusade. The massacre of the Latins in 1182, in which Greek citizens of Constantinople slaughtered every Roman Catholic in the city in cold blood, also hadn't engendered any brotherly feelings toward the Greeks from Western Christians. Had the Crusaders refused to sack the city, and instead treated the population mercifully, the Fourth Crusade today would likely be remembered very differently. The Fourth Crusade is often mistakenly cited as the ultimate cause of the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, but this too is incorrect. Rather, the Byzantine Empire had slipped into a horrible decline over the past 2 decades, with the Fourth Crusade being more a manifestation of its weakness than its cause. Indeed, the very fact that the Latins were able to capture the city is evidence of how weak and corrupt Byzantium had become. It was the ruling dynasty that had brought the Fourth Crusade to Constantinople, the Angeli, who were ultimately responsible for the destruction of the empire. To learn more about this, see my video, The Fourth Crusade. Why did it happen?